New York. Little Italy. 1969, the Italian Mafia banned Frank Lucas from their streets on a Thursday morning, not privately, not through a discreet phone call. In a meeting with 12 men present, with an informal minutes circulated afterward through the proper channels, with a messenger personally sent to Harlem to deliver the notice by hand. Banned, forbidden, persona non grata in every street, every pier, every business controlled by the Lucchese family in Manhattan. 30 days later, Frank Lucas was operating in every one of those streets, not despite the ban, because of it. But to understand how 30 days turned a prohibition into a map of opportunities, you have to understand what led to the ban. And what led to the ban was a single meeting on an afternoon in September 1969 in a back room of a fish market on Mulberry Street, where Frank Lucas did something men in his position simply did not do. He said no. The Lucchese family had built, over decades, a distribution structure that functioned as an invisible toll on practically everything that entered or left Manhattan. Not just drugs, meat, fish, clothing, construction. Any product that needed a pier, a truck, a warehouse, unionized labor, paid a toll to the family at some point in the chain. It was a system so integrated into the normal functioning of the city that most people who paid it didn't even know they were paying. Frank had managed to build his initial operation partly outside that system, through routes the family didn't fully control, through connections he had developed directly without going through the traditional intermediaries. It was a genuine feat. And that was exactly why it had drawn attention. Carlo Tramonti was 61 years old in 1969, 23 years as boss of the Lucchese family, a man of legendary patience and even more legendary memory, the kind who would wait years to solve a problem if waiting meant solving it better. He had watched Frank Lucas for 18 months before inviting him to that room on Mulberry Street. The invitation was actually an offer. The family offered formal protection, access to the controlled distribution routes, and police cover in most of Manhattan. In exchange, 35% of Frank's operation, not of the profit, of the operation. 35% of everything: product, routes, contacts, structure. It was an offer no one refused. Frank refused. Not with hostility. With the same polite coldness he used in any negotiation where the answer had been decided before the question was even asked. He thanked Tramonti for his time, acknowledged the value of what was being offered, and said he preferred to continue operating independently. The silence that followed in the room lasted long enough for each of the 12 men present to understand what had just happened. Tramonti showed no anger. Men who reach Tramonti's position do not show anger in rooms with witnesses. He simply nodded, stood up, and said 3 words before leaving. "Take care of yourself." The messenger arrived in Harlem 2 days later with the formal notice: ban from all streets, piers, warehouses, and businesses under Lucchese control. Any operation of Frank's that depended on family-controlled infrastructure would be immediately shut down. Any supplier or distributor associated with the family who continued doing business with Frank would be treated as having chosen a side. It was a sentence of economic strangulation, calculated with precision by a man who had spent 23 years understanding how illegal economies work and where to squeeze to make them stop working. Frank read the notice, folded it, put it in his pocket, and went home. What Tramonti had calculated correctly was this: Frank's operation depended on infrastructure the family controlled at critical points: piers for product entry, warehouses for temporary storage, distribution routes that crossed Lucchese territory. Removing access to those points would create enough friction to make the operation inefficient, expensive, and eventually unviable without an agreement with the family. What Tramonti had calculated incorrectly was more fundamental. He had assumed that Frank Lucas thought like every other operator who had sat in that room over 2 decades, that he would see the ban as a punishment to be avoided through submission, that the logical move would be to return to the table willing to negotiate better terms, but accepting some version of the rejected deal. Frank did not think that way. Frank thought in systems. And what Frank saw when he read the ban notice was not a punishment, it was a map. Because for the notice to be effective, it had to be specific. It had to name what was being blocked. And by naming what was being blocked, it had inadvertently created a detailed inventory of exactly which pieces of infrastructure the family considered critical to market control, which piers, which warehouses, which routes, which suppliers were worth the threat of consequences to keep inside the family system. It was information Frank could never have mapped with such precision on his own in less than a month. Tramonti had handed him the map of their own system, thinking he was handing him a death sentence. Frank spent the first 5 days not reacting to the ban, operating normally within the limits of what was still possible, letting the family see exactly what they expected to see, the first signs of friction, slightly delayed deliveries, hesitant suppliers, the machine beginning to grind with more difficulty. It was important that they saw that, because while they were seeing what they expected, they weren't looking at what was really happening. On the 6th day, Frank began having conversations he had never had before. The Lucchese family had built its control over Manhattan's infrastructure through a combination of intimidation, favors accumulated over decades, and an established presence that made the alternative to cooperation seem non-existent. But established presence has one specific vulnerability that Frank had identified while mapping the system. It is effective against those who have no alternative. When an alternative appears, established presence becomes mere inertia. Frank went to create the alternatives, not in Manhattan, in Queens, in the Bronx, in Brooklyn. In parts of New Jersey, the Lucchese family had neglected for years because they didn't seem sufficiently strategic. Each of those territories had its own port, warehouse, and distribution infrastructure, less efficient than Manhattan's, more fragmented, more expensive to operate, but completely outside Lucchese control. Frank spent the second week building relationships with operators in those areas, not with money at first, with information and business proposals that made cooperating with Frank economically more attractive than continuing to operate in isolation in a secondary territory. It was a slow process, more expensive, more logistically complicated. It was also completely invisible to the Lucchese family, who were watching Manhattan expecting to see Frank return to the negotiating table. In the 3rd week, Frank found the element that would turn mere survival strategy into something entirely different. The Lucchese family had built its control over Manhattan's ports through unions, specifically through union leadership that had been bought or intimidated over decades until cooperation with the family became simply the default way of operating. But unions have members, and union members have their own economies, their own dissatisfactions, their own perceptions of how much of what passes through their hands they actually see as personal benefit. Frank had identified, through the mapping of the previous weeks, 3 mid-level leaders in 2 of the critical ports who were dissatisfied with the current arrangement for reasons that had nothing to do with Frank Lucas and everything to do with the internal dynamics of how the family distributed the benefits of port control. Those 3 men didn't need ideological convincing, they needed a better offer than what they were getting. Frank made the 3 offers in the 3rd week, specific offers based on precise information about what each one was receiving and what Frank could offer in comparison. None of the 3 conversations lasted more than 40 minutes. All 3 said yes. Frank didn't yet have direct access to the ports, but he had something far more valuable in the medium term, people inside the ports who knew exactly how the Lucchese operation worked at those specific points, what the lowest supervision hours were, which product flows passed without systematic inspection, which operational windows existed inside the family-controlled system without the family realizing they existed. In the 4th week, Frank began using those windows, not to replace the family's infrastructure, to operate inside it without paying the toll, to find the spaces that the family's control had created but could not completely fill due to limitations of attention and resources. Every extensive control system has blind spots. The family had built a system so large that its blind spots had become operationally significant. Frank had mapped those blind spots with a precision that was only possible because the ban notice had been specific enough to reveal where the system was densest and therefore where the gaps between the dense points were largest. On the 28th day, Frank was operating at 18 infrastructure points that the ban notice had identified as exclusively Lucchese, not in confrontation with the family. In parallel, in the spaces the family's control had created but had not fully occupied, using people who were inside the family system but whose loyalty had been redirected by economically more attractive offers. Operating through alternative routes developed in the previous weeks and that now made dependence on family-controlled points a matter of efficiency rather than absolute necessity. On the 30th day, Tramonti received a report from his captains in Manhattan. The report said Frank Lucas was operating in forbidden territory, not through confrontation, not through violence, through a network of cooperations, alternative agreements, and operational windows inside the family's own system, built during the 4 weeks Tramonti had been waiting for Frank to return to the negotiating table. Tramonti read the report with the attention of a man who had spent 23 years assessing threats and opportunities. He reread it. He remained silent for a considerable time. Then he said one thing to the captain who had delivered the report. "Bring him back to Mulberry Street." Frank went to Mulberry Street on the 32nd day. Same back room in the fish market. Same 12 men. Same table. But the dynamic in the room was completely different. This time Tramonti didn't make an offer. He asked a question. "How did you do this in 30 days? Frank answered with the specific honesty of someone who knows that honesty in that moment is more strategic than any evasion. "You gave me the map when you sent the notice. You told me exactly what was important to you. What is important to you is where the alternatives exist for anyone who knows where to look. You banned me from your streets. I learned which ones were all your streets so I could find the spaces between them." Tramonti stared at Frank for a while. Then he did something the 12 men in that room had not seen in 23 years of meetings there. He genuinely smiled. "How much do you want?" Frank named a number that revealed he had come to that meeting already knowing what the family could offer, because he had spent the previous 4 weeks learning the economic structure of the system with the same precision he had learned its operational infrastructure. Tramonti said yes without a counteroffer. Because Tramonti had spent 23 years assessing people, and what Frank Lucas had demonstrated in 30 days was not just operational capability, it was the kind of strategic intelligence that, if kept as an enemy, would become progressively more expensive to contain, and that, if incorporated as a partner on the right terms, would become an asset no amount of money could buy on the open market. The ban lasted 30 days. The agreement that followed lasted years. And here is what those 30 days carry within them that goes beyond Frank Lucas, Carlo Tramonti, and any specific street in Manhattan. When someone with power closes a door in front of you, the instinctive reaction is to try to reopen that same door, to push against what is pushing against you, to use force against force at the exact point of contact where the adversary's force is most concentrated. Frank did not push against the closed door. He mapped all the other doors the person who closed that one had not mentioned because they hadn't even realized they existed, and he discovered that the act of closing one specific door with enough force to communicate inevitable exclusion inevitably reveals to anyone paying attention the full outline of everything on the other side. The ban was the most valuable piece of information the Lucchese family ever handed Frank Lucas. Tramonti had tried to build a wall. Frank had used the wall as a map, and 30 days later he was on the other side. Not despite the ban. Because the ban had been specific enough to show exactly how to cross it. That is the difference between reacting to what is closed to you and learning from what is closed to you. One response uses the adversary's energy against you. The other uses the adversary's intelligence in your favor. Frank Lucas chose the second. And 30 days was all he needed.